Okay, so yes, this is our group, the Space Policy Unit. Reenah, do you want to get us started?
Okay, let me just share my screen. Can you guys see?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so basically we are the Space Policy Unit, and we are one of 3 subcoms in NUS sets. There's the rocketry and NUS rover team. And what's so like unique or special about SPU is basically like we have students from like all different backgrounds and stuff. Like it's not just like a STEM focused club. So yeah, okay.
And NUS is the National University of Singapore.
Oh yeah, NUS is National University of Singapore. So basically like SPU's mission is just to like inspire active involvement in the space policy making process through space education. So like in our club, we get together, we talk about like how to write policy papers, learning how to do it, policy briefs and stuff. And then we also discuss like space policy issues, and we like guide like the recruits, and like we all just work together to really like create space policy papers and like get involved in like space policy in general. Okay, so this is like our entire group. I think like because it's like midterms like now, so not everyone could show up, but yeah. So this is like some of our past works. Last year, like the previous batch, they actually published an insights report, which was like specific to like Singapore's like space industry. And if you want, I can share it with you. This year, we also, two of our SPU members actually participated in GLEC. So that was myself and Lucretia. Like our names are there, I guess, yeah. So if you want, like you can see our abstracts too, but I'm not sure if there's enough time. Like, would you be keen on it? Or if you want, I can show it to you.
Absolutely.
Sorry?
Or you can share them with me after, or however you want to do it.
Okay, I guess I'll show it to you later. Okay.
You can tell me what were the topics of your abstracts.
Okay. Okay, so this is Lucretia's one, and hers was about space mining. Hers was like really like because she's an economics student, so it was extremely technical and was a bit out of my expertise, but it was quite well done, I have to say. This was mine. It was just about like space debris and how we can go about like mitigating space debris in like a realistic way. So that was like the basic rundown. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, Prof Hanlon, you have so much experience, and we have many, many questions that we hope we can ask you today. But let's see where we can get through. So in addition to the club, mostly undergrads from law, political science, business analytics, and me, a PhD student, we also have with us Dr. Cole, who is our space ethics professor at NUS. Yeah, lecturer at NUS. Yeah.
Be with you too.
All right, so Reenah, go for it.
Okay, so the first question, like right off the bat, like what piqued your own interest in space and space law?
So can you first tell me just a little bit about yourself, and then I'm happy to answer. Yeah, and when you ask the question, just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I'm Reenah. I'm the Space Policy Unit Director. I'm a political science student in year 3. The reason why I joined like SPU is because like I always liked space, but I thought it was like quite STEM, like it was just limited to like STEM kids. And so like SPU was like an interesting way for me to be like a part of like the space conversation, despite like being weak at math. Yeah.
Yeah, no, wonderful. So I actually have a very similar track into space law. I grew up as a Trekkie. James T. Kirk all the way. There's no other Star Trek captain for me. But my my mother is Chinese, my father is Polish. We lived all over the world. My parents were US diplomats. And so I really kind of felt like the Star Trek bridge looked like me and my family. And it sort of just was like home for me. But then I went to college and did really poorly in pre-calculus. And I thought, okay, well, I'll just do as a political science major, focusing on international relations, primarily actually covert operations and, national security issues. And then I went to law school and I just went off on sort of the corporate law track. I was a business lawyer for about 25 years doing mergers and acquisitions work. During that time, my son, when he was about 12 years old, said, Mom, I understand you're a good lawyer. I'm like, well, I like to think so. And he said, I just read this really interesting book about the moon and how you can't own property on it. And he said, I really want to, when I grow up, I really want to mine asteroids. So do you think, between now and the time I grow up, you can figure all that out for me? And I was like, huh. And so it was like this full circle, just like, oh, wow. And I had never honestly thought about property in space. And here my 12-year-old son was already so forward thinking. So, I started doing a lot of research, and then I finally decided, enough with the corporate law. And I went back to McGill University to get my LLM degree in space law. And I haven't looked back since. I've just really, really loved this very sort of nascent gray area of the law that has to form really strongly in order to support our future, right? So for me, that's been, it was really spurred by this thought of, wow, we really are going to space. And it took my son to sort of focus me on the fact that our technology advanced so much that this was probably not my lifetime, but definitely his lifetime, a reality.
Okay.
Is this the son that's in Guam right now?
Yes, exactly. So he bought me some time because he went to the Naval Academy and he owes the Navy 5 years before he can start mining asteroids. So I have about 3 years to go before he's out. So I'm working on it.
It's like so interesting how like now like people are arguing about whether it's like ethical to go and colonize Mars. Like that's like something we're actually thinking about now. Elon Musk.
No, and I don't know, as a space nerd, as a space law nerd, when Elon Musk did the first set of Starlink contracts, right, for the internet service for people on Earth, there's a clause in the contract that says if you are getting services on the Earth, then California law applies. If you are receiving services anywhere else, then you recognize that no law applies because you're not on Earth. And for us space law nerds, it was just like, no, you can't do that, because international law does apply to space and your nationality follows you to space. But of course he could do it and he did do it, right? And who knows if he is the first person to put people on Mars, there's not a lot the United States can do to sort of set up laws around them, right? How many months away and we say, oh no, you did that wrong. We can't. And so that's why it's really, space law is so important that we create what we can of that framework that will assure that we don't have like a British East India Company situation for our intrepid explorers on Mars. And so one of the things we're working at the University of Mississippi is trying to reach out to the private space tourism companies and also working with the FAA and saying, look, as part of that contract for carriage, right, we should include something that says, hey, we recognize that human rights apply in space. It's very simple. If we can get every company to do that, it's just like a very simple framework. Declaration of Human Rights applies in space. And on top of the Declaration of Human Rights, which by the way, Article 17 says every human has the right to own property. So that's sort of like, oh, you can't own property. Oh, but you have to own property, right? In space, you have to have that right. This is one of those dilemmas we're facing. But one thing we also don't have, the Declaration of Human Rights doesn't say we have a right to oxygen. So, what does that mean for space, right? And so, it's sort of intuitive here. You don't have to create that right here because it's around us. But we don't have that right in space right now, even if we take the Declaration of Human Rights to space with us. So it's a fascinating time. I get a lot of people, what's driving me bananas, and I think Bill Gates said something about it again today. There's enough problems on Earth. We don't need to be spending money on space. Well, I don't particularly care for Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos that much. I think they're arrogant. I think they're egotistical. But you know what? God bless them. They are spending a lot of their own money to figure out how to get humans into space. And I'm so glad someone is doing that, because it would be difficult for a government to convince its taxpayers, right, that this is something worth pursuing. And so thank goodness we have people, not only people who are willing to put their private fortunes behind it, but people who are willing and able to pay $250,000 for a 10-minute ride, right? I mean, just, to support that business, so that the more celebrities we get who do that, the more the price will come down. And there's a prayer that I might get up there myself.
So like along that line, like how can like space laws be effectively implemented? Like who's like the space police, if there is one?
So you're a political science major, right? Yeah. You understand enough about public international law that there really isn't an enforcement mechanism under international law. We look at the Spratly Islands, and we have the entire Court of Arbitration decide that China was wrong and should withdraw, and China said, "Oh, that's nice," and proceeded not to do anything. Yeah. So the enforcement under international law is really sort of that name and shame and, "Oh, you did bad, we're not going to do business with you," kind of. And that's the same thing we have going into space, except it's even grayer, right? Because it's much harder to see what's going on. It's so much easier to the precepts we have in the Outer Space Treaty. What are the firm laws? We know international law applies to space, but international law in and of itself is sort of gray and amorphous. The Outer Space Treaty says, Article 1, freedom of exploration and use, right? And Article 2, no appropriation, non-appropriation can't appropriate it. Article 4, you can't put WMD up on orbit, and you must use space exclusively for peaceful purposes. So you have this right to freely roam space and do whatever you want in it. It is the only three things that counter that are international law applies. It must be used for peaceful purposes exclusively, and you have to have due regard for the activities of others. Yeah. Okay, that's a lawyer's, Disneyland, right? Due regard, what does that mean? I mean, that can be litigated for years, right? Well, I think, and we have the only guidance we have from a legal standpoint is from the Chagos Islands case. It's an International Court of Arbitration case that came in under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. And the court said, we cannot create a bright line rule for due regard, and which makes sense. It has to be flexibly applied. But then it said, so we're going to look at the rights of the first part. What? Sorry,
which case were you talking about that you mentioned?
The Chagos Marine case, CHAGOS.
Okay.
And so they said, you're going to look at the rights that were impinged. You're going to look at the rights that were kept. You're going to look at how much it cost. What were the alternatives? That is what I'm looking for, a rule like that, because that there's so much gray. So what we really need to do now, and when we talk about enforcement, is we need to start putting some of those rules together. And that's why the Artemis Accords, the U.S. has, since President Obama signed the Asteroid Act in 2015, the U.S. has had a sort of a steady drumbeat towards a steady pace towards nudging the international community to figure out what due regard means and how we're going to enforce it. And now we have the Artemis Accords, which have introduced the concept of safety zones. They didn't introduce them. They were their first international instrument to include the concept. And that's what we need to have. That's what the kind of ruling we need for enforcement. We need to have international consensus on what a safety zone needs to look like, and how big it should be. And then we can start enforcing, okay, there should have been a safety zone of 300 meters or whatever. But right now, even when you think about close encounters on orbit, satellites, near misses, we've had one satellite collision in space, the Russian satellite, defunct Russian satellite hit an Iridium satellite. And so that was the only time we've had the opportunity to sort of use the liability convention, and they settled out of court. So we really have no concept of even how liability will work with respect to space.
I was just wondering if our law students, David or Ryeson, if you guys have any questions at this point.
Wait, Ryeson, I think his mic isn't working, but he just asked a question. He sent it to me, so I'll just ask on his behalf. How realistic is it for such consensus to be reached, especially since the Outer Space Treaty has been around for so long, has not been ratified by most countries?
So it's not very optimistic. The outlook is not optimistic. You're absolutely right, Ryeson. We have not negotiated a binding treaty since the Return and Rescue Agreement or the Registration Convention, whichever. The last failed treaty. Sorry, I shouldn't say failed. The last treaty, the Moon Agreement, was not widely ratified. But we have had, since then, we have had a lot of soft law. We have resolutions regarding remote sensing principles. We have resolutions regarding debris mitigation. We now have the newest set of resolutions regarding long-term sustainability of outer space activities. And there's a lot of sort of theory about at what point these resolutions become customary international law. I don't think these, excuse me, sorry about this.
Yeah.
Sorry, I meant to turn my phone off.
Sorry.
So we do have this concept of customary international law, that we could build these soft resolutions into customary international law. The Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space just created a working group to look at space resource utilization. So do I think we're going to get a space resource treaty out of that? No, but I do think we will get some nice non-binding resolutions. Of course, remember, when you come out of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, these decisions are made by consensus. So everyone has to agree in order for it to become a resolution, right? Every single word has to be agreed on. And so it's very difficult. It's for a nation to sit in the COPUOS and say, and not object to some language, and then say, oh, I'm not going to abide by that language, right? So in a way, with the Moon Agreement, we had this negotiation, we had everyone talk about it, and then we made it a treaty that you have to sign, and only 18 nations ratified it. So in many ways, this sort of soft creep might actually work a little bit better. And of course, if it becomes customary international law, it's binding whether you sign an agreement or not. But the other piece is, don't forget, we have the Artemis Accords, and we have this controversy now because we have the Artemis Accords, and then we have now this Russia-China base, right? Yeah. And I think they made an announcement today that they're going to talk more about it in Dubai. What's really interesting about that competition is that Russia and China have said, we're going to work together and have a base, but they haven't produced their own set of principles and guidelines. And they've never said those principles and guidelines are wrong, right? And if you look carefully at the Artemis Accords, all but like 3 of the provisions just reinforce the Outer Space Treaty. And this is actually the fear, I think, of many nations, is that the United States will get a lot of buy-in with the Artemis Accords, and it will become equivalent to a multilateral convention, and then in and of itself ultimately become customary international law itself. So we are sort of at 13 nations who have signed. And remember, the Artemis Accords aren't treaties either. The Artemis Accords are agreements that we're going to agree to something with this framework in mind. So everything right now is just sort of this amorphous, like something's got to give kind of. And I'll be honest, I think, we at For All Moonkind, my NGO, we say that the best way to achieve an agreement, a binding agreement in space is to select a topic that we all agree on. And on Earth, here on Earth, 193 nations have ratified the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. So every nation in the world recognizes the importance of safeguarding, protecting, preserving human cultural artifacts. And so if we can take that concept, we can't apply the Heritage Convention to space because properties and sites are selected within your territory. You can only nominate a site within your territory to become a World Heritage Site. Well, of course, you can't do that in space because you can't claim territory in space. So we need a whole new convention to protect and safeguard heritage in outer space. Since we do it already on Earth, it shouldn't be that hard to get that agreement in space. And in the 4 years that I've been going to the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, not one delegate, not one observer, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about China, we're talking about Russia, not one country has said, that's a really bad idea and walked away. Everybody says, of course we have to protect it, but we don't know how to do it. And so For All Moonkind is really focused on figuring out how to do it. And so to answer the question of will we ever have another binding treaty in space, I think starting from the point of heritage is our best bet because we can say we already have agreed to these principles. And if we can reach agreement on that and we can say, okay, we need to safeguard, we're going to safeguard it by creating a safety zone and then move on from there, then I think we have our baby steps to a treaty. That's the rose-colored glasses, very optimistic me. The more realistic me, I think we're going to have the Artemis base, and I think we're going to have the Russia-China base, whatever it's going to be called. And I think they're going to be on separate sides of the moon. And I think that at some point they're going to meet each other, and they're going to figure out that they're going to create a pact or something and ignore our squabbles on Earth. And that's going to be the basis for our future humanity. That's my hope.
Tze Min, do you have any questions?
Oh, I think I had a bunch of questions and because like a lot of the information. Okay, maybe some background about me. I'm not a space I'm not like a space student. I'm not really a law student either. I'm a business analytics student. So I look at data analysis, usually for business purposes. But I joined the space policy unit because I wanted, like, space has always been that really interesting, that really cool sector that you learn about as a child, but then when you grow up, you don't really know how to get into it or even if it's possible. So especially in our country or in Singapore, because it's not really a very huge thing here. So I think I was wondering, I came across your For All Moonkind website. I was looking through, I was really curious. And I think for what you guys do regarding taking the concept of space as a site for, I guess, preserving cultural heritage, that is the idea, right? You're saying that yes, we can use this idea to kind of get the countries to buy into to buy into, how to put it, ensuring that this how do I say, like is that a precedent for a treaty that's more binding? Is that how I can summarize it?
Yeah, so think about it like, yes, I think that if we put aside all the concepts of space resource utilization and took out the piece of, me, I want, we need these resources, and we just focus on the cultural heritage. We just focus. So in the 1960s, Egypt decided that it needed to dam the river, the Nile River, and create the Aswan High Dam, right? But to do so meant that they were going to flood the Nubia Valley. The Nubia Valley is considered one of the birthplaces of human civilization. one of the cradles of human civilization, right? And so Egypt didn't just, dam the Nile and flood everything. Egypt went to the international community and said, hey, can you help us? We want to do this, but we recognize that this is going to destroy a lot of human heritage. What should we do? And the international community didn't say, okay, stop Egypt. No, you can't do that. And they didn't say, oh, you're on your own, Egypt. They said, okay, we're going to help you. 40 nations came together and contributed manpower, human power, contributed money, contributed expertise, and they moved those temples out of the Nubia Valley, out of the floodplain, piece by piece in the 1960s. I mean, think about that technologically.
That's impressive.
So there is a real understanding on Earth that heritage is important. And when you read about how the World Heritage Convention came to be and how UNESCO came to be, that talks about kinship and reminding people that we are all from one. So I always start my presentations with the Toli footprints in Tanzania. So there's a plain in Tanzania that has 8 footprints running across a path that are preserved in volcanic ash. And archaeologists believe that's the oldest proof of when we went bipodal, when we stood up on 2 feet, we humans, and freed up our hands. And why is that important? Because it freed up our hands, then all of a sudden we could carry things, and all of a sudden we could write, and all of a sudden we could create fire and create tools. We don't get to the moon unless somebody stands up 3 million years ago. We don't get to the moon unless some individual in the Congo picks up a baboon bone and starts etching math on it. We don't get to the moon unless the people in Mesopotamia have figured out how to make glass. We don't get to the moon without centuries of astronomy from across all cultures around the globe, helping us understand the stars. And so that is what we're trying to capture at For All Moonkind, is that boot print. Neil Armstrong didn't get there on the backs of 400,000 Americans. Neil Armstrong got there on the back of the entirety of human history. And that's why we need to protect, not just the boot print. I mean, Luna 9 was a Soviet, the first human-made object to hard impact another celestial body. Luna 9 was the very first soft impact. Chang'e 4 is the first impact on the soft impact on the far side of the moon. I mean, all of these things happen because of what we have done as a humanity, and none of those would have occurred in a cone.
Yeah. Okay.
I was listening to the talk that you gave to the Space Cafe. I believe it was, you had also shared the examples in that talk as well. And one statement that stood out to me was when you said development and preservation go hand in hand. So for me, as a Southeast Asian studies student, we do come across all these things about development, how do you maintain the indigenous cultures and also, allow for modernization, urbanization, and all of that. But with space being such a forward-looking kind of discipline, how important is heritage?
Oh my goodness. It's fun being here in Guam because, I always use the example. I know that Guam, the people aren't Polynesian, they're Chamorro, but I always use the example of the Polynesians, and it's very similar to the migration from the Philippines to Guam. But the Polynesians looked out they lived on their little island, right? And they looked out at this vast ocean. They didn't see anything on the horizon, but they decided, hey, we're going to build a boat and see what's out there. That's exactly where we stand right now, right? We are just looking out in space, I don't know what's out there. I'm going to build a spaceship and see. And how did the Polynesians survive from island to island? They brought their culture with them. And when that culture means they brought with them the knowledge of how to farm and how to grow food. They brought with them the culture of how to build these boats, how to build these houses. And it wasn't handed down in history books. It was handed down through their oral histories, right? And so and it was handed down through dances and through the hand movements. And when you think about building communities in space, you don't have anything without this understanding understanding of where you came from. I mean, the austerity of space is bad enough as it is, right? You need to recognize the accomplishment it was to get there and embrace the culture, all of the cultures that got us there. I like to think about it, and I used to say, I want kids to go to Tranquility Base and laugh at the eagle and sort of, stare and wonder at the fact that two human beings actually made it to the moon in a piece. I mean, honestly, it was like we had no business being on the moon in that capsule, right? I mean, it was a miracle that it worked. And they created this entire debris field because they threw out everything that they could because they didn't even know if they could get back. Just thinking about what they threw out, what they brought with them, that is humanity. It's the gumption, it's the want to get to explore, and it's the desire and the challenge, the acceptance of the challenge and the acceptance of possible death in order to make that exploration. And how sad would it be if we lost that, if we lost the memorial to that?
That's interesting. So I guess that also gives us an international perspective of space history too, not just the ones that succeeded. I was wondering, Dr. Cole, do you have a question?
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I'll just quickly introduce myself. My background is in bioethics, research background is in bioethics, but I also teach communication skills. So I'm in the fortunate position of being able to teach students to write about ethical issues in any outer space context you can imagine. So it's pretty rich. The students come from all different academic backgrounds, so it's very interdisciplinary by nature and great fun to teach. It's a real sort of hobby job of mine now, I suppose it's become. I'm just sort of following my own personal interests fully here. I've got students that are very interested in the moon and the sort of appropriation of resources from it. And I think they're beginning to get to grips with the fact that the Moon Treaty is, as you say, rather amorphous. It hasn't obtained very much buy-in through countries ratifying it. And so they're quite curious about the prospects for, future exploitation of lunar resources. So could I just broadly ask you, where do you think we're heading in terms of oversight or control of what either even private enterprise, if not nation states themselves, might do with the lunar resources?
It's such an interesting question, and because people usually just say space resource utilization, they don't separate it out, and I think we need to. The space is infinite, but our moon is not. And I think we really need to, a lot of people are like lunar governance is space governance, and it's really not just because the resources are finite, but also because there are so many cultural traditions wrapped up with the moon. And when I talk to people about space resource utilization, the immediate reaction is, well, I don't want the moon to look different, I think it would take a lot to make the moon look different to the naked eye. But that's the visceral reaction. Don't do something to make it look different. What is lunar governance going to look like? The Artemis Accords are, trying to create this concept of these safety zones. What they don't do is they don't talk about conservation at all. What I think is missing right now from our outer space obligations. We have Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says we will prevent harmful contamination, forward contamination of other planetary bodies, as well as backward contamination. And out of that, we have the Coast Bar, which says, if you're going to go to Mars, you need to make sure you're completely debugged and decontaminated, because we don't want to contaminate Mars. We don't have that for the moon. When you talk about Coast Bar and harmful contamination, we're talking about biomaterials. We're not talking about anything else. It was very clear from the history of Article 9 that they were concerned about biological contamination, not about conservation of any physical features or anything like that. And so I think we really need to step back and think about, okay, what are we really doing? One of my biggest concerns about lunar governance is some of these companies are financing themselves by promising to send people's junk to the moon. So I don't understand how we have the right as humans to just say, hey, I'm going to send my ashes there. You know, where on earth can you just send your ashes and let them sit somewhere? So that, you know, what is the moon? It cannot be the attic for rich people on earth, right? It's got to be treated somewhat differently. I think that there's a lot of different groups right now working on the lunar governance model. We have the Moon Village Association. We have the Open Lunar Foundation, For All Moonkind. I think the Artemis Accords are our first big step towards thinking about it. And I think the hope of Artemis is that enough states that are actually going to the moon will, you know, buy into that Artemis. But I do think, as I said, I think we're going to have two competing bases or communities, if you will. And again, from what I've read, from what I've seen, there's no contradiction yet with regards to governance. Russia and China haven't said, no, we don't want safety zones. They've been quiet, you know, they might still say that, but so far they haven't. And so far this concept of safety zones is out there and floating and nobody's shot it down. How we're going to implement them, what they're going to look like, you know, are they going to be 20 miles? Are they going to be 1 mile? Who knows? But I think that is a really positive sign that we've had the Artemis Accords now for a year. And the criticisms of it are not that they're wrong. The criticisms are primarily that they're not multilateral. The United States should have done this through COPUOS instead of striking out on its own. So I think that's a positive step.
Right, thanks. But you remain sort of optimistic also about the potential for multilateral kind of buy-in to what has been established under Artemis. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Yeah. I think your class is so cool. I would love to teach sort of an ethics, and because there's so much to think about. And you know, we joke about the prime directive, but I mean, really, and when you read the history of COSPAR, you know, they really are talking about saving an amoeba or whatever and deciding not to touch a planet. But I think, yeah, it's a tough one to say. Are we really going to stop Elon Musk from going to, you know, building something on Mars if we find evidence of life? Yeah.
Right, yeah. I mean, who gets there first gets to call the shots in some practical senses. And yeah, exactly. The ethics sometimes follows after. Yeah. Great.
Actually, Professor Cole, I have a question for you.
Oh, okay.
So like, because like in one of my classes, I was learning about how like previous like colonizers did not see the colonized as like human. In fact, they saw them as like subhuman. So like, what if like, okay, a hypothetical situation, like what if like Elon Musk goes to Mars and then like there's like aliens there, like do human rights apply in space?
By extension to the aliens?
Yeah.
An interesting question, isn't it? I mean, moral intuition tells us obviously it should, but then we also have to reckon with the fact that the aliens might be wholly different from us. So what might be beneficial to us might not necessarily be quite so beneficial to them. But in terms of respecting them as separate autonomous entities, of course, just, you know, general morality would dictate that we should respect them and perhaps also leave well alone in terms of the prime directive, as Prof Hanlon mentioned, deriving from Star Trek days, the 1960s. I suppose, I mean, that can be extended beyond just cultural intervention. I think in the Star Trek universe, it was conceived of in terms of like interfering with the cultures, really, wasn't it? Rather than just disturbing planetary surfaces or microbes that might exist on them, etc. Yeah, we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past in terms of presuming terra nullis, you know, that nothing exists there, you know, that's of any worth until we get there. and claim it for ourselves, as happened with the settlers in Australia. So there's a really unfortunate sort of imperialist kind of history to humankind that we need to shed going forward. And you know, even the language of colonization seems somehow inappropriate now, and I know it's been challenged, and you know, replacement terms have been offered up, so we shouldn't even presume to talk about colonizing space because of the historical baggage of the term itself. So something more neutral like settlement seems more appropriate, but you know, you can't really presume to settle in a place which is already inhabited, you know, without it causing
How about you, Professor Hanlon? What do you think about this?
Oh, I mean, I think, you know, this is why I always use the Polynesians in my example, because all the islands that they went to are unpopulated, right? So, you know, sort of look at that model of how we move forward. It's funny because the term Wild West, the term colonization, even the term settlement, I think carries this baggage and a lot of sort of Western issues and problems. I always use the word communities, and even then people have yelled at me because they think it sounds like commune, and you know, they don't want that either. And I just think, well, it's just the future of humanity, let's just call it that. If we, you know, there's two schools of thought with respect to aliens, you know, yes, we should morally, we have the responsibility, I think, to, you know, treat them as we would treat a human. But it was funny because as Professor Cole was talking, I was thinking, you know, we eat cows on Earth, or, you know, chickens, right? What if we find a planet populated with something chicken-like? You know, do we then just presume that they're not intelligent and we can eat them? I don't know. If we don't, if we sort of make those chickens pristine on planet X, should we be making them protected here on Earth as well if they're that similar? So yeah, I mean, I don't know. But the other school of thought is, if we meet aliens, we should assume that they're evil and want to eat us, right? You know, why are we assuming we're the ones who are going to be in a superior position? And so it may be, you know, this question may be moot, right? You know, we might be the ones that they're just like, or they bring a virus to us that we can't cover or whatever. And so, you know, there has to be a sense, I think, of humility in that maybe it will never be our decision.
Yeah, that's one of the arguments that's made against METI, isn't it, or messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, for fear that they would somehow necessarily be superior to us in order to be able to kind of decode our signals, and therefore might look down upon us so greatly that they would annihilate us. So yeah, it ties into sort of so many, you know, issues to do with, you know, space exploration through an ethical lens, really, in terms of, you know, how we value ourselves and what we might be exposing humankind to. I liked your point about the possible sort of backward protection rather than contamination of species on Earth by virtue of recognizing the value of similar species on another world. I like that.
Yeah, and I'm just mindful of your time. We're 10 minutes to 6 p.m. where you are. Would you be able to stay on for maybe 15, 20 more minutes? Would that be all right?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, this is fun.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, Ryeson. It's good to see you. Would you like to ask something? Ryeson has a very keen interest in going into the space industry.
Hi, yes, yeah, my name is Ryeson. I will keep it short because I'm in a room full of people right now. Yeah, I really enjoyed your thoughts about it, especially on the idea and how it needs to be small incremental steps, you know, soft wins before we go into something bigger. I had a couple of questions that I did pass to Reenah, but I've lost all of them now since that I changed to my computer. Reenah, could you help me out here?
Okay, wait. Okay, another question you can ask is about coexisting with China's space policy.
Just a sec, Ryeson, could you just share a bit about your background, what you're studying, and your
Sure.
passions?
I'm currently a law student at National University of Singapore. Always been interested in space law. That's where my passion lies, and that's actually one of the reasons why I decided to study law. And yeah, really grateful that there's a SETS chapter here in Singapore that I'm able to be part of. Yeah, and my really curious question is how does I guess you did touch a bit about it in when you're talking about the China and Russian space station that they're building together in their space policy, but how could it work together? You know, we've seen it kind of working in parallel, but how does it converge? How can it converge?
So, I mean, I don't know. And we have, you know, in the United States, we have the Wolf Amendment, right, which says we can't work with China without the approval of Congress, which makes things very difficult. I believe that this is a problem that's going to be solved off-world. You know, I think this is a problem where we are going to have maybe two space stations, a Chinese one and a private one, and they have to do something together. Or maybe it is, you know, communities on the moon, a Artemis one and a Chinese one. I have to think that once you get off Earth, you know, with Frank White, who wrote The Overview Effect, right? He interviewed hundreds of astronauts, and all of them, the taikonauts, the cosmonauts, the astronauts, all have that same sense of, oh wow, you know, we're really in this together. Wow, you know, that's my home. That in looking at the globe, not at their country. When you look down, there's no borders, and this is a universal thing, and it's now hypothesized that perhaps there's actually a physiological change in your brain when you leave orbit and are able to see the Earth as round. And so I think we have to be optimistic and think that when we do have thriving communities, 80 people, and they're in parallel, they're the ones who are going to say, oh no, we need to do this together, because they're going to be looking back on Earth and thinking that we're the ones who are stuck down here and are being really stupid. And so I see our future as peace from space, not having to achieve peace before we get to space.
Thanks, Prof. I'm actually another law student, but yeah, similar to Ryeson, I think that space law is really just an emerging area of law, and there are a lot of gray areas that are associated with it. And actually, what you just mentioned actually piqued my interest. You mentioned that, if I'm not wrong, that nations that laws related to space should in future be ultimately created by space-dwelling citizens. And my question is, right now we have the UN organizations on Earth that are presumably helping to legislate on behalf of future spacefaring citizens. How should we take into account their interests? And in future, where we want to transfer that legislative power, how do you foresee we might want to limit the jurisdiction of Earth's nations, or even individual nations like the US in the Artemis Accords?
So I personally think that we need to move away from the sovereign paradigm. I think we are doomed if we continue. People forget, you know, the states were made by laws. You know, the states don't make law makes states. And law is about human relationships. Law starts, and let's go all the way back. How did we get law in the first place? we got law because we had a family unit and everyone listened to the dad or the mom, whether you were a matriarchal or patriarchal society. And then two family units were like, oh, hey, it might be smart for us to do something together to protect us from these other family units. And so they created these laws that govern how they're going to interact with each other in their little society. And that grew and grew and grew and grew. And so I see that the space communities, you know, I don't see the UN as a legislative body. So I don't see the UN as the one that's going to decide how these communities will govern themselves. I think that we are going to be stuck in that sovereign paradigm for a while, you know, because we have Artemis, and then we'll have China and we'll have Russia. And look, I mean, with space station, we couldn't get away from the paradigm. The Russian part has Russian law, the Japanese part applies Japanese law, the US part, you know, so that's going to be what it looks like. But this is what I was talking about when we first started our conversation. We need to accept that reality. But instead of sort of ignoring it and putting our heads in the sand and moving on and saying, oh, well, good luck to you, there are things we can do now that you can do as young space policymakers and space lawyers to set the framework that we need to see the future that we want to see. And that is lobbying companies to say, put human rights in your contract. And that is lobbying your government to say, look, when you do create a national space law, let's talk about heritage and culture. And also think a lot about bringing, you know, one of the other things about space, it's supposed to benefit all humankind, right? And so what does that mean? And how we can't just leave behind, you know, Ghana and Zimbabwe and Sri Lanka, you know, we cannot continue with this, you know, I got there first concept, because that's not who we should be anymore. And I'm not saying I believe companies ought to go and they ought to mine and they should not have to share their benefits, but there have got to be the concept of sharing. The concept of province of all humankind doesn't mean share your profits. It means we're a human community and we ought to be in this together, and let's figure out ways to bring, like while I'm here in Guam, I'm talking space law to the university students here because there's no space lawyer in Guam. So we're going to build that capacity. And that's what we need to do technologically as well. And that's really challenging. But I think, David, I think there is, I mean, hopefully we don't need to have a revolution, right? For, you know, free Mars. But you know, I think we can build, you guys can build that natural progression to freedom that we need for our space brethren.
That is very inspiring. Thanks, Prof Hanlon. Ryeson has had to drop off for a class, but he says, love the idea you shared, and he has to step out. Yeah.
Professor, I actually have to step off as well. I have a class, but thank you so much. It was so wonderful to meet both of the professors actually, and all of you. I love our conversation about colonizing Mars, especially. Okay.
Thank you, Reenah. Yeah, I can still hang around a bit. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions, Dr. Cole, Tze Min, David, or Prof Hanlon? Do you have any questions for us?
Actually,
so at NUS, are there space law classes, you're teaching space ethics, but are there space policy classes, or is it just the student group?
Good question. I can't answer because I'm not sort of connected to the law faculty. I just do my own independent thing, you know, following, as it were, my own interest, drawing on my ethics background. But yeah, the law student should be able to better answer. That would be it's David now, isn't it? We'd have to David as our sole representative.
Yes, there is actually an elective program that we can take for space law. I didn't take it this year, but I'm thinking of taking it next year to kind of cement what I've been doing so far in like an academic program. Apart from that, I think there are a couple of other faculty members that are working on areas related to space. Like NUS has a banking it has kind of like a banking faculty or unit that and one of the people in there is really interested in satellite policy and satellite related law. I think he gave a talk last year that I attended, or earlier this year actually that I attended.
Yeah, we have an active space industry in terms of microsats in Singapore, and a gentleman who's the managing director of one of them invited me to speak with him, consult with him. I guess he thought I might be more expert than I actually am in this area a few years ago on the recommendation of one of my students who met him at a law conference at NUS. But it did give me an opportunity to kind of peer into the workings of his, his industrial operation and how they assemble these miniature spacecraft, which I found absolutely fascinating. I couldn't probably answer his sort of liability concerns about what happens when one of his machines, goes out of control and might impact something else. But it did give me a little glimpse into what's going on practically here. And one of his complaints was he couldn't attract sufficient numbers of Singaporean graduates as engineers into his business. So I don't know if that's changed in the last sort of 5 years or so. But I think the space industry has continued to grow here in this kind of quite specialized area, given our limited land space, etc., manufacturing capacity. But to work in this sort of high sort of value added area of technological development. And I know they use Kazakhstan, the Baikonur launch base, to deliver their hardware into orbit. So there is an active space industry in that kind of scale anyway.
In one of the other major universities, Nanyang Technological University, they have a satellite research center. I think that one's a bit more engineering focused. Yeah, but at NUS it's quite limited for now. Although my prof did agree to me doing a space kind of independent research project for the next couple of sems. So yeah, so my PhD project is focused on disaster management, and my prof is an expert in technopolitics. So for me, what I propose is how disaster management from space can help Southeast Asia to re-narrativize or like retell its story as a spacefaring region. Yeah, so it's very interesting what you've shared about Guam. I think there would be some similarities there. Yeah.
So I find it really interesting because, Luxembourg has sort of inserted itself, it's a tiny little landlocked country, but it followed the US with its space resource utilization law. So if you are licensed payload by Luxembourg, then, if you mine it, you own it. And so Luxembourg has created a real space industry, and it's become kind of a space policy power because it has really invested a lot of money in building this. It saw that banking was dying, and so just went all in on space. And similar with Dubai, right? UAE sees that the oil business is dying, and they've gone all in on space. Mars 2070. So that's why I was just curious, because to me it's like UAE, Luxembourg, Singapore are very similar, from my perspective, looking at countries that are, so I'm interested to see if the space industry continues to grow.
Yeah, me too. Do you think we have more of a chance? Do you think we have more chance to be?
Well, we're on the equator. That might help.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the money to invest, and then bringing in. I think if you look at UAE was able to do it even with this Emirati setup. I mean, it very different. I mean, Luxembourg. I think I'm just thinking in forms of government and being able to push something through. I did a research project on Luxembourg, and it was very much Etienne Schneider was like the single reason Luxembourg has a space program, because that's what he thought would work, and he was the finance minister and he did it. So yeah, it'll depend on who, if you get the ear of the right person and put the space bug in their head. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, Prof Hanlon, I was actually really curious about your career trajectory because you've done so many things in your life related to space, in terms of business, in terms of academia, even a nonprofit, For All Moonkind. How do you do it all? Like in terms of managing, and also, I mean, what's the mindset with which you do all these things? And are there any restrictions as a woman? Do you face any glass ceilings in a new industry like this?
So, first of all, I don't sleep a lot. I'll be honest. And I will say that I came out of law school and I went into a big law firm experience. So, big law. I billed an 80-hour week, which meant I worked 120 hours a week. And coming off of that, everything else is just sort of is relative, right? That was my life for 10 years. And so stepping back from that, I took breaks. I was fortunate to be able to consult on my own time when my boys were young. And so, with my boys, we would take the entire summer off and camp across the United States. And so I feel like my husband and I sort of went back and forth. Like I took a good job and he, was the one who was sort of like taking care of the boys. And then it was his turn to make the big bucks and I took care of the boys. And so we're really lucky in that we had that balance. As far as being a woman, I don't feel like, so I started a law firm in 1992. I was the first woman in my law firm, first attorney in my law firm to get pregnant. None of the women attorneys got pregnant because they knew they wouldn't make partner if they got pregnant. And I was like, okay, well then I don't want to be partner. Like that's my mindset. It's like, okay, it's not I'm gonna be a mom and a partner. It's just like, oh, that's not what I want. My choice is to have the baby. And yes, I recognize it's going to change things. But you make your own path. All due respect to the men on the call, women are so much better at multitasking. We are so much better at doing 18 things at the same time. And you can do it. And it's hard. It's very hard. It's never going to be easy. But if you're passionate about something, then the more challenging it is, the more fun it is, right? I mean, I think, people look at me and say, I can't believe, this is my first time taking time off and not being in an office, in a very long time. But it's the challenge, and you rise up to it, and you make sure that you have at least 3 or 4 people who will be there when you're really frustrated, and who will listen to you and who will get you a glass of scotch and make you turn off your computer. But yeah, you don't stop. You just don't. And I will say, and I have students. I had an attorney come in to present to my students, talk about working for the government. He's a civilian attorney for the U.S. Air Force, and he said, he didn't say I love my work. He said my work-life balance is great. And he left, and I said to my students, I said, if you want work-life balance, don't be a lawyer. Like, why are you spending the money to get this extra education, work-life balance? No, you got to love your job and throw yourself into it. So yeah, women, every woman has the capacity to be a superwoman, and you find it when you find what you want to do.
Wow, that's super. Any challenges from space though? I mean, or is it just okay to forge your own path in the space industry? I'm just thinking about Hidden Figures, which I watched.
Oh, so it's been the. So you mean sort of being a woman in space?
Yeah.
So I also live in the South. I live in Mississippi. And so I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a meeting and been assumed that, I wasn't the one in charge. You know, again, my reaction is not, hey, it's, oh, you poor thing, like you just, you aren't evolved enough yet to understand. So you rise above it. I mean, that's, yeah. And within the space community, there are a lot of women space lawyers, which is really nice. The engineers and so forth. I'm also older now though, and we got a little bit of gray hair, and so I think I get treated a little bit differently for that reason. And I'm that presenter who's always on mute, so I think people are just like, oh God, here she comes again. But no, I honestly think you will face discrimination. You'll face discrimination for being Asian. You'll face discrimination for being a woman. You'll be harassed, but you find that strength. I would absolutely say, don't rely on other people to be that strength for you. It has to be you.
Yeah, making that decision. Tze Min, do you have any questions?
I was actually wondering, because I was thinking back to earlier in the call when you talked about us as, I guess, students having to I can't remember exactly what phrase you used, but you were saying that we had to be the ones to kind of, I guess, bring forward the idea that we are more than just I guess part of a sovereign. So, back to that idea. But I was wondering, like, how, I guess, in your experience, how do you engage people outside of the space community? Like, how do you engage them into this idea, I guess? Because
so
I mean,
that's a real struggle. It's an incredible struggle, and people really, sometimes you walk into a meeting that's not space related and you start talking space and you can see people's eyes glaze over, I personally am, I have the benefit of having the cultural heritage piece. And so I'm sort of using that to get into different venues from traditional space venues. In the United States, it's a lot of lobbying. Before COVID, I would spend an entire month in DC and just really honestly walk the halls and talk to people. And that's how we got the one small step back to pass in the United States. I was talking to a staffer that I just had an appointment with, and they have to meet with you because we're citizens. And I said, no, I'm worried about orbital debris, and I'm worried about this, and I'm worried about that. And he actually looked at me, stopped, and said, what can we fix? Like, is there something, can you give my senator a marquee project that he can take as a win? And I said, yes, I can give you this one small step back. And they did it. So it's that the voice, the more you talk, the more you're out there on LinkedIn, the more you're out there and in your network, the more you get heard. And that's you just can't stop talking. That's all.
Basically, you have to put yourself out there too, instead of waiting for people. Okay.
There was one talk you gave, and you mentioned that that the space industry is kind of built from the ground up. Do you have any practical tips on how that can happen?
So I think the concept was that our rules have to work from the ground up, right? So the problem with regulation is that if you start to regulate and you don't really know what you're doing yet, you're going to stifle growth and development. So when I talk about having the regulation from the ground up, what I think would be ideal is if commercial industry got together and said, okay, we're going to agree to these 5 things on the moon, right? We're talking about lunar governance. Forget the sovereigns. Let's get the commercial entities to agree to certain things. And then there is a trend now. There are a few scholars arguing that commercial entities can make customary international law, because for the first time they're doing things that it used to be only sovereigns could do. So we should include them in our concept of how we build international law. But when I say it's got to, when we think about things that have worked very well, the motion picture industry, they self-regulate, they created their own system, and that works, right? And so that's the kind of concept I would like to see. If we get commercial entities to work together to agree to a certain set of standards, then the governments are along for the ride and they're not as important. That sovereign is not as important. So that's what I mean by building that industry from the ground up, getting industry to make these decisions. One thing we haven't talked about is, Starlink and those satellite constellations. Then there's a big movement, the dark skies, saying, wow, you're polluting the orbit with light pollution, and we can't even see for all our astronomical instruments and stuff. So, I'm on a working group that includes Amazon and SpaceX and OneWeb, and we're trying to figure out, okay, how can we keep the astronomers happy and keep the light pollution down in a way that's cost effective? That's what we need to see more of. We need to see more of industry with the people who are concerned working together.
It's more, you would see it more private sector driven?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any more questions?
That's fascinating. I'm really, really glad to hear that. That's something I can share with my students, I think, in terms of where things might be headed in a rational sort of direction that takes cues from past practices and sort of learns from past mistakes. Very good.
We saw some of the opportunities available for All Moonkind. Tze Min.
Oh, yeah. I think I mentioned earlier I was looking through the For All Moonkind website. I was very curious about it. Like, it's the first time I heard about the idea of the moon as a cultural heritage, a site for cultural heritage. And I think we saw some volunteering opportunities, but I wasn't really sure of the details. We also saw under the education tab, I think.
Yeah,
there was
so,
an opportunity for talks and presentations. Yeah.
So we welcome volunteers, but for example, right now we're really, China has challenged our status as a permanent observer because we have the messages of peace written out on the website, and and one of the messages of peace is from the Republic of China, and People's Republic of China is objecting to the inclusion of Republic of China on our website, and says that we should not. So I haven't decided yet what we're going to do, because politics aside, from a historic standpoint, the message of peace is from the Republic of China. And so I take real exception to actually changing history. And the messages of peace are a disc on the moon. You can't go up and change the disc on the moon from Republic of China to Taiwan province of China. That's not history. So I haven't decided what we're going to do, but what that means is that we are approaching 2022 as if it will be our last year in the UN. That doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to work, where there are a lot of other venues that we work through, but we're really focused on building a very strong presence at the 3 meetings in February, April, and June. And so we're asking for volunteers to help us sort of do the research and write out for, one thing is a resolution that would recognize Apollo 11, Luna 2, and Chang'e 4 as something special. If we think we can maybe get a UN General Assembly resolution to that effect. And then the other thing is just a conference room paper, they're called, just sort of laying it all out, what we do, why we're doing it, how it can get done, just to get all of that into the record of the UN in case we're not welcome back in 2023. But so that there are always discrete research opportunities. So if you're interested in that, then just shoot me an email and we can talk more about your particular interests and how that can fit into research that would support For All Moonkind.
All right. As in, you're saying that the status at the UN is being challenged because of the Republic of China, that particular law?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Mhm.
Wow. Right. I guess the other thing was the education. I think I saw that you listed your email there as a point of contact if undergrads wanted to engage For All Moonkind for presentations and talks on space law and policy.
So you want to give presentations about For All Moonkind to students in Singapore, or?
I mean, I understand from the website that the presentations would come from For All Moonkind, right?
Yeah, I guess what would that look like from For All Moonkind? Yeah. So would it be like you giving a presentation about For All Moonkind, or how does it look like?
Oh yeah, no, that would be me coming, absolutely zooming in or coming and giving the presentation on For All Moonkind. It's my co-founder is my husband, and he's the marketing guy. So everything that looks really pretty is all from Tim.
It's really pretty. Yeah,
that's all Tim. But the policy, I sent him to one policy talk, and I think I heard him say, the Outer Space Treaty should be abolished, and I was like, okay, hun, no. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, if you I would love to. I look at me. I can talk all day long. I'm very passionate about this. So if there are opportunities for me to meet with small groups of people, when COVID is done, I hope to do a lot more traveling again. My children are grown, so there's nothing keeping me at home, and I love to travel. So absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, hopefully you can swing by Singapore the next time.
I would love to. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any last words, Dr. Cole, David?
Just one last curious question. In terms of For All Moonkind sort of protection of these historic sites where various nation states have landed their first significant lunar vehicles, would that same reasoning apply to all future landings by any other nations that have not yet reached the moon? How does that go?
So this goes back to that get rid of the sovereign paradigm, right? So our argument, what we would like to see is we want to celebrate human firsts, not national firsts. And so, yes, for this resolution, strategically, politically, we would pick Russia, China, US, because that's politically important to do. But our actual concept for safeguarding preservation, safeguarding cultural heritage is human heritage, universal heritage. And so right now, if you think about it, everything that's on the moon probably has some first related to it, right? But we definitely do not want, first Swedish person on the moon, first Norwegian person on the moon. Yeah, that's ridiculous. We can't do that. So,
right. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, it's been fascinating. Really enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Yeah, David.
Hi, Prof. I was actually quite interested in by the comment that you made about how the space industry should and regulation in there should ultimately be private sector driven, because I think we're kind of facing that issue in Singapore as well, because right now we have by the government there is the Outer Space Office, but there isn't actually that much legislation or regulation on what say satellite building companies should pay attention to, like specialized industry guidance from the government. So I think like the comment you made about the private sector consensus being very important is particularly apt in this scenario as well. But how exactly do you think that we should draw the line between private and public, especially with regard to the space sector? Because I think, like you mentioned earlier, you were on a working group with Facebook and is it Facebook or SpaceX that ultimately one of the guiding concerns of in the end was that you had to keep the astronomers happy, but it had to be cost effective. So what line should we draw? Big question.
It has to be case by case, right? Sorry, my lights are going down and I don't know how to turn the sun's going down. I don't know how to turn my lights on. So
No worries.
fade. It has to be a balance. I mean, you think about, I always liken it to privacy and national security, right? I mean, we constantly are trying to find that balance between allowing drones to police us and being able to shut our doors in our homes, you know, cybersecurity and so forth. Where is that balance? Where do you, I mean, this whole working group is trying to decide where is that balance between it's between development and you know, other concerns, right? And it goes all the way back to what Professor Cole was saying also about ethics and what this, you know, what do we owe aliens? And those are really big questions that we have to be prepared for, and we have to continue to think about. But I think the most important thing, and what I've really found with this working group, with the astronomers and industry, is they're at the table yelling at each other, you know, and that's so important, is to get the conflict out there and identify what the conflict is, because too often the conflict gets caught in politics, and it shouldn't. There is a conflict, find the seed of that conflict, and you can deal with it. And so, you know, in many ways, David, it is asking the impossible, because we can't imagine right now a world without those politics, but that's what we need to achieve.
Thanks, Prof.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Prof Hanlon. If you're here in Singapore, we might give you some Singaporean food, but next time, hopefully.
Nice.
But yeah, I mean, just
Awesome.
the way to say thank you. Well, the easiest thing over Zoom. I wrote this poem about space, and I'll just share it with you. So it's called A Space for Me. Many people have said things about space. Space is an inspirational concept, said Peter Diamandis. It allows you to dream big. One giant leap for mankind, Neil Armstrong said, after he made one small step for man. They all said many other things about stars, about putting our best energies into building rockets, putting rockets into the stratosphere, putting the stratosphere in its place, so we can all play the infinite game of space. And then they turned to me and asked, so what do you have to say? And right there, I had a choice. Would I use my voice, or would I pass when I was asked? I was stressed. I only had a best guess, but I wanted to live on the other side of yes. I wanted to carve a space within the spaces, find my rhyme within the lines, one that I could call uniquely mine, to make a mark, a spark, to add to the conversation as an original product of my place and times. Looking up at the planets, I felt very small, but I would give it my all, to never lose the wonder, to speak truth to power with grace and with tact about my journey there and back. So I sat down as I wrote up against the wall, but deep down inside, I was standing tall. So what do I have to say? My answer is still being written, but I know I'm going somewhere, even as I'm right here sitting. As I consider the galaxies out there further than my eyes can see, right here with my pen in hand, I know there is a space for me. Yeah.
Beautiful.
And thank you for being such an inspiration as well. Just going where no man or woman has gone before.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry about the darkness, but
No.
yeah, and let's do this again. This is a lot of fun.